The sky above New Helsinki was always gray. On the edge of the Orion expanse, the colony city rarely saw sunlight. Its streets were filled with smoke, noise, and people who no longer looked at each other. Among those people was Jonah Wexler, a HFY man who spoke to no one and kept to himself. He had once been a cargo pilot, flying between planets with goods and stories. Now he lived alone in a small apartment above a broken-down repair shop. It was on one of those gray mornings that Jonah saw her. She was lying near a food stall in the lower district where the air smelled of metal and trash. At first, Jonah thought, she was just another lost child. But something about her made him stop. Her skin was pale with a slight shimmer, and her limbs were too thin, almost fragile. She wore a torn cloak and her feet were bare, covered in dust. Her eyes were closed and her chest barely moved. People walked around her, ignoring her like she didn't exist. Jonah looked closer. She wasn't human. He crouched beside her. Her face was small, delicate. Faint lines ran along her temples, glowing very softly like tiny patterns under the skin. She looked about 10 years old, though Jonah wasn't sure. He reached out and touched her wrist. Cold. Too cold. "She's not one of us," someone muttered, nearby. "Let her be. You'll get in trouble." Jonah looked up. A group of market workers had stopped to watch. "She's just a kid," he said. "Not our problem. Might be infected. Might be dangerous. Let security take her." Jonah stood up, ignoring them. He gently picked the girl up in his arms. She was so light it shocked him. Her head rested on his shoulder and she didn't even stir. People stared but said nothing more. Jonah carried her through the back alleys, avoiding patrols. Taking in an undocumented alien, especially in New Helsinki, was risky. But Jonah didn't care. He had lived through war, through loss. He had buried people he loved, and for some reason, he couldn't walk away from this child. His apartment was small and quiet, metal walls, a sleeping cot, and a dusty shelf filled with old books and tools. Jonah laid the girl on the cot and fetched a clean blanket. He wrapped her up gently, then brought a heater close. After a moment's thought, he made a bowl of soup, thin broth with soft vegetables, and waited. An hour passed. Then 2. Finally, the girl stirred. Her eyes opened slowly, deep violet, bright even in the dull light. She blinked at the ceiling, then at Jonah. "You're safe," he said softly. "Don't try to move yet." She tried to sit up, but gasped, in pain. Jonah moved closer. "Easy. You were passed out on the street. You haven't eaten, have you?" She looked at him but didn't speak. Her eyes were alert, but her lips trembled. Jonah offered the bowl of soup. "I don't know if this is what your kind eats, but it's warm. Try it." She took the bowl with shaky hands. Slowly, she sipped. Her eyes stayed on Jonah the whole time. Not in fear, but caution, like someone used to being hurt. Jonah didn't ask her name. He didn't ask where she came from. He just sat, quietly nearby, letting her eat. Later that night, while she slept, Jonah sat by the window, watching the neon lights flicker outside. He thought about calling someone, maybe a medic, maybe one of the refugee centers. But he knew what would happen. She'd disappear into some lab or vanish into paperwork. She didn't look like anyone's citizen. He had seen this before. Aliens who didn't belong. Children left behind by war. And this one had nobody. He looked back at her. Her small form rose and fell with each breath. Her face looked peaceful for the first time. "I'll call you Kira," he whispered. That was the name of a star. A peaceful one. She didn't stir. Jonah leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Maybe trouble, maybe questions. But for now, she was safe, and he would protect her, even if it meant going against everything he had tried to forget. The days following Kira's arrival were quiet, too quiet. Jonah kept to his routine, fixing old equipment for clients, occasionally looking over his shoulder to make sure no one was watching. His workbench was cluttered with tools and forgotten projects, but he didn't care. His mind was elsewhere. On the alien child who had begun to heal in his small apartment. Kira hadn't said much, but Jonah could see the changes. Her bruises faded and her breathing became steadier. Each day he'd bring her food, always simple, always cautious, unsure of what she might eat. She never complained. She never spoke unless she needed something, like water or warmth. But her eyes were always watching, learning, watching him. Jonah found it strange how easy it was to care for her. She never cried, never asked for much. It felt almost like they had always been together, as though he'd been waiting for someone, even though he didn't know it. Every evening, as night fell, Kira would sit on the small cot and gaze out the window, staring at the city lights, the stars barely visible above the smog. Jonah would sit at the table, pretending to focus on his work while stealing glances at her. One morning, as Jonah returned from the market, he found her sitting on the floor, playing with the small pieces of metal he had left out from an old repair project. She was making strange patterns with the metal scraps, carefully arranged triangles and circles that didn't make any sense to him. Her small fingers moved with precision, like she had done it before. "Kira," Jonah said, unsure how to speak to her sometimes. "What are you doing?" She looked up at him, her violet eyes wide, then pointed to the metal pieces. "Building." "Building?" Jonah raised an eyebrow, walking over. "What are you building?" She didn't answer, but she pointed at one of the metal triangles, then at the window. Jonah followed her finger to the distant skyline. He couldn't understand what she meant, but for some reason he felt as if she was showing him something important, something he hadn't noticed before. "Right," Jonah muttered, trying to make sense of it. "Building what?" But Kira didn't respond. She just returned to her task, quietly arranging the pieces into a shape Jonah couldn't quite understand. He watched for a while, thinking about how strange everything had become since she arrived. He was used to being alone, but now he felt something else, something new, a sense of responsibility. Days passed without much change. Kira ate, slept, and quietly observed the world around her. She never spoke unless necessary, and when Jonah tried to ask her about her past, she only shook her head, her eyes sad and distant. He didn't push. He knew she had her reasons. Whatever had happened to her, it was clear that she was scared, maybe even broken. Jonah tried to make things normal for her. He took her out once when he felt it was safe. They walked through the streets of New Helsinki, though Jonah couldn't stop looking over his shoulder. He hadn't seen any signs of the strange people who had been asking about her, but he knew they were out there. The city was full of eyes. Kira stayed close to him, her small hand gripping his sleeve whenever they passed a group of people. She wasn't afraid, not exactly, but she was careful. Jonah could tell she didn't trust anyone but him. After a few days of silence, Jonah noticed that Kira had started to hum softly to herself. It wasn't a song he recognized. The melody was slow, soft, almost haunting. He couldn't help but feel that it came from a place deep inside her. Maybe a memory, maybe a dream. "Kira," Jonah began one evening as she hummed again. "Where did you learn that?" She stopped, looking at him for a long moment. Her eyes were unreadable. Then she spoke in a soft voice, barely above a whisper. "It's my song." Jonah was surprised by the sound of her voice. It was the first time she had spoken so much. It was faint, like a breeze in the night. Her words made his heart ache. In a way he couldn't explain. "Your song?" Jonah asked gently. "What does it mean?" Kira didn't answer. She simply hummed again, her small voice floating through the room. Jonah didn't push her further. He didn't need to. There was a sadness in her hum, a longing that filled the small apartment and made everything feel heavier than it should. She had lost so much, and he could only offer her a small corner of safety in his world. Jonah didn't know how much longer he could keep Kira hidden. There were always whispers, always someone looking. But the thought of returning her to the authorities, of sending her back to those who might hurt her, was unthinkable. She had nowhere to go, no family, no one left. And so, for now, they remained together in silence. Jonah didn't know what the future held, but he was starting to realize something he hadn't expected. The loneliness he had carried for so long wasn't as heavy with her there. Even though she said little, even though she barely smiled, she had brought a strange kind of peace to his life. In that small, forgotten corner of New Helsinki, Jonah Vexler and Kira, the alien child, were learning to live together. Jonah had gotten used to the quiet. The city outside was loud and full of life, but in his small apartment, it was just the soft hum of the heater and the occasional sound of Kira moving around. It had been weeks since she had arrived, and though Jonah tried to keep things as normal as possible, he could feel that something was shifting. She was healing, slowly but surely. The bruises on her face had faded, her skin was no longer as pale, and she was starting to smile, though it was small and fleeting. But there was something Jonah couldn't shake, the feeling that they were being watched. Every time he stepped outside, there was the lingering sense of being followed, of eyes on the back of his neck. At first, he told himself it was just paranoia, but it was hard to ignore when every corner of the city seemed to hide someone. He had been careful to avoid any attention, keeping Kira inside as much as possible and making sure she didn't show herself too much in public. Still, Jonah couldn't shake the feeling that someone was looking for her. One evening, after the sun had set and the orange light was beginning to fade from the sky, there was a knock at Jonah's door. It was light, barely a tap, but it was enough to make his heart skip a beat. Jonah glanced over at Kira, who was sitting on the floor, her small hands playing with a piece of metal again, like she often did. She hadn't heard the knock. She was too focused on her task. Jonah stood up slowly, his hands slightly shaking. He hadn't been expecting anyone. Not at this hour. He moved quietly across the room and peered through the small crack in the door. Standing there was a woman, tall and thin, wearing a long dark coat that covered most of her figure. Her eyes were hidden behind a pair of dark sunglasses, but Jonah could see the faintest glint of light reflecting off them. She didn't look like anyone he knew, and her presence made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Jonah hesitated. Should he open the door? He didn't know who she was, but something about her made him uneasy. He couldn't ignore the feeling that she was there for Kira, and that thought sent a chill down his spine. The woman knocked again, this time more urgently. "I'm not looking for trouble," Jonah said through the door, his voice steady. "If you need something, you'll have to come back tomorrow." There was a pause. Then the woman spoke, her voice calm, almost too calm. "I'm not here to cause trouble, Jonah." "Vexler," she said, her tone smooth and collected. "I know what you've been hiding. I think we need to talk." Jonah's heart raced. She knew his name. That wasn't good. He didn't respond right away. His mind raced as he considered his options. Should he call for help? Should he try to escape with Kira? He quickly glanced over at her, but she hadn't noticed anything. She was still absorbed in her game, blissfully unaware of the danger that was at the door. The woman didn't wait for a response. She pressed a small button on the side of her coat, and Jonah could hear the faint buzz of a hidden speaker. The door clicked open just a little bit, as if she were testing it. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Jonah. I'm here to help you. I know what you're hiding, and I know you've been looking for answers." Jonah swallowed hard. She was talking about Kira, no doubt, but how could she know so much about him? And how did she know about Kira? "Who are you?" Jonah asked, his voice trembling just slightly. The woman smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I'm someone who can give you answers. And I'm someone who can protect both of you from what's coming. But you have to trust me. Jonah's mind spun with questions, but he didn't let any of them escape. Instead, he stepped away from the door and glanced at Kira again. She was still, focused on her task, unaware of the woman at the door. Could he trust this stranger? Could he trust anyone? Finally, Jonah made his decision. He opened the door just a crack, enough to speak but not enough to let her in. "What do you want?" he asked, keeping his voice low. The woman's smile softened and she took a step closer. "I'm not here to hurt you or the child, Jonah. I just want to help you protect her. There are people looking for her, dangerous people. You know that, don't you?" Jonah's stomach twisted. The woman's words were too true. He had known. It all along. The moment Kira had come into his life, he had felt it. The danger lurking in the shadows, the eyes watching from afar. The bounty hunters, the corporate mercenaries. They were all out there, waiting for the right moment to strike. He wanted to ask her more questions, but something about her calm demeanor didn't sit right with him. Was she truly there to help? Or did she have her own agenda? "I'm not making any decisions yet," Jonah said firmly, keeping the door closed between them. "Not until I know more." The woman didn't seem surprised. She took a step back, her expression unchanged. "Wise," she said softly. "But remember this, Jonah Wexler. Time is running out. People like me are not easy to come by. Think about it. The longer you wait, the harder it will be to protect her." With that, she turned and disappeared into the shadows of the night. Jonah stood there, staring at the door, his mind spinning. He didn't know if he could trust her, but one thing was clear. The danger had just become more real. Kira was no longer just a lost child. She was the key to something much bigger. The night felt heavier after the woman left. Jonah didn't sleep much, and when he did, his dreams were filled with fragments of images. Strange alien landscapes, dark figures moving in the shadows, and the haunting sound of Kira's soft humming. He couldn't shake the feeling that his life had become tangled with something far larger than he had ever imagined. By morning, Jonah knew he couldn't ignore the danger anymore. The woman's words had stuck with him, echoing in his mind. "People like me are not easy to come by. Time is running out." Jonah stared at Kira as she sat by the window, her eyes gazing out at the city below. She seemed so small, so fragile, sitting there in the fading light of the morning. She had become a part of his life in ways he hadn't expected. He found himself caring for her in ways he never thought possible. But this wasn't just about keeping her safe anymore. Kira wasn't just any child. Jonah needed answers. He spent the next few hours digging through old records and databases. As an ex-pilot, he had access to some of the less-than-official networks. He had heard of alien species, of refugees fleeing wars and dying planets, but he never thought he would be involved in something like this. He ran searches on the name Lorraine, but found little. Most of the information was locked behind government codes or classified files. But there were hints, fragments of a story he could barely piece together. A species called the Lorraine, a peaceful race, once thriving on a beautiful planet far from Earth until something happened, something that wiped out nearly their entire population. Jonah wasn't sure who did it or why, but the records spoke of a war, though not one fought by armies. It was more of a quiet, hidden battle between powerful corporations and worlds that refused to bend to their will. The Lorraine had resisted selling their planet to a mining corporation, and soon after they were destroyed. Or so the records suggested. Yet, somehow, Kira had survived. She was the last of her kind, the last living Lorraine. Jonah sat back in his chair, stunned. It was all starting to make sense. Kira wasn't just any refugee. She was the last of a lost species, and there were people who would stop at nothing to find her, to use her, or even to erase the last traces of her kind. He glanced over at her again. She was still sitting by the window, her gaze distant, as though she could see something beyond the buildings and the fog that filled the sky. Jonah wondered what she thought about all this. Did she even know? Had she witnessed the destruction of her people? Or had she been too young to remember? Jonah didn't have answers, but he knew he couldn't hide anymore. He needed help. Later, that day, he met with his old contact in the Resistance, Rhea, a tough, no-nonsense woman who had always been a little too willing to fight the system. She was the kind of person Jonah used to rely on when he needed information or resources that were off the books. Rhea's small apartment on the outskirts of New Helsinki was cluttered with old tech and stacks of papers. When Jonah arrived, she didn't look up immediately. Instead, she continued to fiddle with some equipment, her fingers moving quickly over the controls. "You're late," she said without looking at him. "What's the emergency?" "I need to know about a species called the Lorani," Jonah said, keeping his voice low. "And I need to know everything." Rhea stopped what she was doing and raised an eyebrow. "Lorani? That's a name I haven't heard in a long time. They were wiped out. No one talks about them anymore." "Exactly," Jonah said, his voice tight. "But I've got one, a girl. She's the last of them, I think. I don't know what to do." Rhea leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing. "How do you know all this?" Jonah hesitated, not sure how to explain the events of the past few weeks. "I've seen the records, I've heard whispers, and I've got a girl who's different. She's one of them." Rhea was silent for a long moment, her face unreadable. Finally, she stood up and grabbed a small data pad from her desk. She scanned it for a few seconds before looking back at Jonah. "They were peaceful," Rhea said, softly. "The Lorani never wanted to be part of the galactic wars. They just wanted to live their lives, but they got caught in the crossfire of corporate greed. After the attack, they were erased from the records, like they never existed. But Kira—" "She survived," Jonah said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's the last one." Rhea looked at him carefully. "You need to understand something. The Lorani weren't just a race. They were different. They had abilities, powers, really. Some said they could control the elements. Others believed they could communicate with the stars themselves. But most of that is just myth. The point is, she's not just some refugee. She's a symbol, a key to something much bigger than you or me." Jonah's stomach turned. "What does that mean?" "It means," Rhea said, her voice hardening, "that there are people out there who will do anything to control her. Anything. And if they find out she's still alive, they'll stop at nothing to get her back. And that includes you, Jonah." Jonah's heart raced as the weight of Rhea's words sank in. He had always thought of Kira as just a lost child, a fragile, broken soul he had taken in. But now, he realized she was much more. She wasn't just running from the past. She was running from the future. Jonah's mind raced as he left Rhea's apartment. The city outside seemed even more suffocating than before, the gray sky pressing down on him as though the world itself was closing in. Kira wasn't just some lost child anymore. She was the last of her kind, a living relic of a species that had been nearly wiped out. And there were people, dangerous people who wanted to find her. Jonah had always thought of himself as an ordinary man, just a pilot with a small, quiet life. But now he was tangled up in something far bigger, something that could cost him everything. He didn't know what to do next. He couldn't keep hiding her forever, and he couldn't trust anyone. When he returned to the apartment, Kira was sitting in the same spot by the window. Her eyes were distant, her fingers lightly tracing the cold glass. She had been so quiet lately. Jonah had learned that silence could be just as heavy as words, and Kira's silence felt like a weight he couldn't lift. He approached her slowly, unsure of what to say. "Kira," he said softly, crouching down beside her. She turned her head slightly, her violet eyes meeting his. He could see the curiosity in her gaze, but there was also something else. Something deeper. "Do you remember anything?" Jonah asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Kira didn't answer right away. She simply stared at him for a long moment, her eyes full of something Jonah couldn't quite place. Then she nodded, just slightly. "I remember home," she said, her voice soft, almost lost. It was warm, and the stars were bright. Jonah felt his chest tighten. He had no idea what home meant to her or what memories she carried with her, but it was clear that whatever had happened to her people, it was something she would never forget. "I can't let them find you," Jonah said, his voice firm. "I won't let them hurt you." Kira looked at him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Jonah wondered if she even fully understood the danger she was in. But then, to his surprise, she nodded again, a quiet understanding passing between them. She had been through so much already. She wasn't the helpless child Jonah had once thought her to be. Over the next few days, Jonah continued to search for answers, but the more he uncovered, the more questions seemed to arise. The Lorani, Kira's people, weren't just a race of aliens. They had been caretakers of something much older, something the galaxy had forgotten. Ria's warning echoed in his mind. "She's a symbol, a key to something much bigger than you or me." But what did that mean? What was Kira the key to? And why did people want her so badly? Jonah couldn't answer those questions, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't stay in New Helsinki any longer. The longer Kira remained there, the more likely it was that someone would come looking for her. He had to get her out of the city, out of the reach of those who would use her for their own purposes. Jonah packed what little he had, quietly slipping through the back streets of the city, making his way toward the outskirts. Kira followed, him silently, her small hand gripping his sleeve, her eyes constantly scanning the shadows. "Where are we going?" Kira asked softly, her voice barely audible over the noise of the city. "Somewhere safe," Jonah replied, though he didn't know where that was yet. He hadn't figured out his next move, but he knew he couldn't risk staying in the apartment any longer. They made their way to the old docks on the edge of the city, where the air smelled of salt water and rusted metal. Jonah had a contact here, an old friend who could help them get off planet. But even as he walked through the abandoned docks, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Jonah's pace quickened as he moved deeper into the shadows, trying to lose the feeling that someone was watching them. He didn't know if it was just paranoia, but it was hard to ignore the cold chill running down his spine. They reached the old hangar at the end of the docks, a place Jonah had once used for covert deliveries. The door was unlocked, and inside, the dim light revealed a small ship, a cargo vessel, nothing fancy, but it would be enough to get them out of New Helsinki. Jonah didn't have time to think about what might happen next. He hurried to the cockpit and began running checks, his hands moving quickly over the controls. Kira stood by the door, her eyes darting around nervously. Jonah could feel her tension. She knew something wasn't right, just as he did. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed from outside the hangar. Jonah froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked at Kira, who was already backing away into the shadows, her small figure blending with the darkness. "They're here," Jonah whispered under his breath, his mind racing. He turned back to the ship, his fingers flying over the controls, trying to prepare it for takeoff. He couldn't let them catch them now, not after everything they had been through. The footsteps grew louder. Jonah didn't have much time. Kira, sensing the danger, moved quickly to the cockpit, her small hands gripping the edge of the seat. She looked up at Jonah with determination in her eyes. "Go," she said, her voice steady. Jonah nodded. He didn't know where they would go, but he knew they couldn't stay here. He hit the ignition, and the ship's engines hummed to life, filling the hangar with a low, vibrating sound. With a deep breath, Jonah pushed the throttle forward, and the ship shot out of the hangar into the cold night air. Behind them, the city of New Helsinki faded into the distance, but Jonah knew it wasn't over. Not yet. They were running. But they were running toward something bigger than both of them. The ship soared through the skies, leaving New Helsinki far behind. Jonah kept his focus on the controls, his fingers moving methodically over the buttons and levers. He had done this 1,000 times before, piloting, navigating through space, but this time it felt different. His heart was racing, not just because of the technical skill required to navigate the ship, but because he was carrying something precious. He was carrying Kira. She was sitting quietly beside him in the cockpit, her violet eyes staring out of the window. The vastness of space stretched out before them, a sea of stars, distant and cold. Jonah glanced at her. Despite the uncertainty and danger, she seemed at peace. There was something calming about the way she gazed into the dark expanse of space, as though she belonged there, as though the stars were her old friends. "How long until we reach the border?" Jonah asked, breaking the silence. He needed to focus on the task at hand. Kira turned her head, her expression thoughtful. "Not long," she replied in her soft voice. "You are a good pilot. We will be safe." Jonah chuckled lightly, though there was a nervous edge to it. He had always been a good pilot, but this situation felt like something out of his control. "I hope you're right." Kira nodded, then returned to her quiet vigil. Jonah wasn't sure how much she understood about their current situation. She was only a child, after all. But there was something about the way she carried herself, the calmness in her eyes, that made Jonah think she knew more than she let on. She had seen things, experienced things he couldn't even imagine. Jonah couldn't help but wonder about her past, the memories she held from her homeworld, the life she had lost. She had told him once about the warmth of her planet and the stars that had always been so bright. The Lorani, her people, had lived in harmony with the world around them. It wasn't hard for Jonah to imagine the peaceful beauty of her home. But that was before. Now, her world was gone, and she was here, on the run, hiding from the very forces that had destroyed everything she had known. Jonah didn't know what to expect when they reached the border, but he knew it wasn't going to be easy. There would be no place to hide forever. He had made a promise to Kira, though. He would keep her safe. The stars outside the window seemed to blur as Jonah pushed the ship's engines harder, hoping to put as much distance between them and New Helsinki as possible. He could feel the ship's engines vibrating beneath his feet, the hum of the machinery steady and comforting. Still, Jonah kept glancing over his shoulder, watching the distant horizon. He couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone in space. He had been a pilot long enough to know that something felt off. The quiet of space seemed too still, too empty. It was as if something was waiting for them, lurking just beyond, the edge of his vision. "Kira," Jonah began, his voice low but steady. "Do you feel anything?" Kira tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing. "I feel strange," she said slowly, "like we are not alone." Jonah's grip on the controls tightened. He had hoped it was just his imagination, but Kira's words confirmed his fears. Something was out there. He couldn't see it, but he could feel it now. A presence, distant but growing closer. Before he could say anything else, the ship's sensors beeped urgently. Jonah's eyes snapped to the control panel, where a warning light flashed red. "Damn it," he muttered, quickly adjusting the ship's trajectory. A moment later, a series of blips appeared on the radar. Jonah's heart skipped a beat. There were multiple ships closing in on them, their signals barely detectable through the vastness of space. Whoever they were good at hiding their presence. Too good. "Hold on," Jonah said to Kira, his voice tense. He pushed the throttle forward, trying to gain speed and distance, but the ships behind them were fast. He couldn't outrun them. Not like this. Kira's small hand gripped the edge of her seat. She seemed unfazed by the danger, but Jonah could see the slight tremor in her fingers. She was scared, even if she didn't show it. She was just a child, after all. The sound of a warning signal blared through the cockpit, and Jonah's heart raced. The pursuing ships had locked onto their coordinates. "Damn it, they've found us," Jonah said, swearing under his breath. He had to think quickly. They needed cover, somewhere to hide, somewhere to regroup and plan their next move. Jonah looked around the cockpit, his mind working fast. His only option was a nearby asteroid field. Dangerous, unpredictable, but it could give them the cover they needed. "We're going to have to take a detour," Jonah said, his voice steady but urgent. "Hold on tight." Without waiting for a response, Jonah steered the ship into a sharp dive, heading straight for the asteroid field. The ship shuddered as it entered the field, dodging rocks and debris that floated in every direction. Jonah's hands moved with precision, avoiding collisions and keeping them on course. The pursuing ships followed closely behind, their engines roaring as they closed in. Jonah could see them now, shadowy silhouettes against the backdrop of asteroids. They were catching up, but Jonah wasn't ready to give up yet. He had come too far to let them catch him now. The ship jerked suddenly as a stray asteroid hit one of the thrusters, sending them into a dangerous spin. Jonah cursed as the controls slipped from his grasp. But Kira was already there, her hands moving over the buttons and switches with surprising speed. "You need to stop," she said calmly, her voice cutting through the chaos of the cockpit. "You are too close." Jonah froze, looking at her in shock. Kira was controlling the ship, just as easily as if she had done it her whole life. Her small fingers danced over the controls, guiding the ship with a calm precision that even Jonah couldn't match. "Kira, how are you?" "I know the stars," Kira interrupted. "I know how to fly." Jonah stared at her, stunned. He had known she was different, but this was something else entirely. As Kira took the ship into a smooth glide, Jonah couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. She wasn't just running from the past. She was the key to something more than he could understand. And now they were escaping. Together. The asteroid field stretched out in all directions, a swirling mass of rock and debris. Jonah felt his pulse racing as he watched Kira guide the ship with skill he never thought possible. It was like she had become one with the ship, her small hands moving with certainty as if she had been piloting ships for years. "You're amazing," Jonah whispered, his voice filled with awe. Kira didn't look at him. Her eyes were focused on the asteroid field, her expression calm. It was almost as though she was born for this, as though navigating through space was second nature to her. "I know," she said softly, her voice steady and clear. "I was taught." Jonah's mind raced. Taught? By who? Had she learned all of this from her people? Or was there something else, something deeper about Kira he didn't fully understand? But now wasn't the time for questions. They had to survive first. The ships chasing them were still behind, but they were struggling to navigate through the dense field. Jonah knew they couldn't keep this up forever. The longer they stayed in the field, the more dangerous it became. The asteroids weren't predictable. One wrong move, and they could all be destroyed. "Kira," Jonah said, trying to sound calm. "We need to find a way out of here." Kira's fingers moved over the controls again, adjusting their course. The ship wove between large asteroids, narrowly avoiding collisions. Jonah could feel the tension in the air, the constant danger pressing in from every direction. Suddenly, the ship jolted. Jonah's heart skipped a beat. The control panel blinked with warning lights and the ship's thrusters sputtered. "We've been hit," Jonah exclaimed. He quickly tried to stabilize the ship, but the damage was already done. They were losing power fast. "Hold on," Jonah shouted, his voice tight with urgency. "We need to make an emergency landing." He quickly steered the ship toward the nearest large asteroid. It wasn't ideal. It was jagged and irregular, but it was their only option. As the ship descended, Jonah braced himself for impact, but Kira's voice stopped him. "We can make it," she said, her voice calm and confident. Jonah looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" Kira's eyes met his, her expression steady. "I can fix it." Jonah stared at her in disbelief. She had already shown him incredible skills. But this? Fixing a ship in the middle of an asteroid field? It seemed impossible. But the determination in her eyes told him there was more to Kira than he had ever imagined. They landed with a hard thud, the ship shaking violently as it made contact with the surface of the asteroid. Jonah quickly unstrapped himself from his seat and rushed to the rear hatch. He knew they had no time to waste. "We need to act fast," he said, motioning for Kira to follow him. "The other ships will be here soon." Kira nodded, but instead of following him, she stayed behind. In the cockpit, her fingers once again moving over the controls. Jonah didn't know what she was doing, but he didn't have time to question it. He dashed out of the ship, scanning their surroundings. The asteroid they had landed on was barren and rocky. There was no sign of life, only the silence of space. Jonah's breath came out in shallow gasps as he worked to assess the damage to the ship. Minutes passed, but they felt like hours. Jonah worked quickly, trying to stabilize the ship's engines, but it was clear they were in no condition to take off again anytime soon. That's when he heard it. A soft, humming sound. At first, he thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him, but then he saw Kira. She was standing by the ship, her hands held out toward the damaged engine. The humming grew louder, and Jonah's eyes widened as he saw the ship's systems beginning to repair themselves. "Kira?" Jonah whispered in disbelief. "What are you doing?" Kira's eyes were closed now, her face serene. "I'm fixing it," she said simply. Jonah watched in awe as the ship's engines began to hum, back to life. Sparks flew from the panels, but Kira's energy seemed to guide them, smoothing the edges of the damage with a strange force he couldn't understand. She wasn't just using technology. She was using something else, something he couldn't explain, and then, just like that, the ship's systems were fully restored. The warning lights stopped flashing and the thrusters hummed to life once again. Jonah stood there, speechless, as Kira opened her eyes and looked at him. There was a quiet strength in her gaze, a confidence that Jonah had never seen in anyone. "So young! How did you—" Jonah stammered, his voice filled with wonder. "I told you," Kira said with a small smile. "I was taught." Jonah didn't know what to say. He was still processing what had just happened, but there was no time for more questions. They were safe, for now, but they weren't out of danger yet. He climbed back into the cockpit, and Kira followed him. The ship was ready to go, but they both knew it wouldn't be long before the other ships found them. Jonah's mind raced, trying to figure out where to go next. He had no answers, no plan, but he did know one thing for sure. They couldn't go back. "Where do we go from here?" Jonah asked, turning to Kira. Kira looked out the window, her gaze drifting to the stars once more. "We go where the stars take us," she said, her voice filled with quiet certainty. Jonah didn't question her. He trusted her. Somehow, he always had. He set the course for the edge of the galaxy. They would keep moving, keep running. They didn't know what the future held, but together they would face whatever came next. As the ship lifted off and soared back into the vastness of space, Jonah knew this wasn't just a flight for survival anymore. This was the beginning of something new, a new chapter in their lives, and maybe even in the history of the galaxy itself. They were no longer just running. They were charting a new course. Together.